I'll go find out. On the screen there. On its bottom right is a plus. Just press the plus. We good.
Hello. How are you doing?
Good, how are you?
I caught your and Gustavo's coverage of SONA last night.
Just want to turn this off.
Not that we could see anything inappropriate.
Noted. Yeah. No. Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, members of the diplomatic community, all protocol observed. My name is Isabel Bosman-Burnett. I'm a researcher in SAIIA's African Governance and Diplomacy Program, and it is my honor to be your program director for today and welcome you to our event, Global Turbulence and Regional Leadership, a post-SONA dialogue on South Africa's foreign policy in 2026. As we all know, President Ramaphosa delivered the State of the Nation address last night against the backdrop of critical inflection points in global affairs. South Africa's foreign policy orientation faces unprecedented complexity. strained relations with Washington following disputes over land reform and the International Court of Justice case against Israel, a transformative G20 presidency concluding amid heightened geopolitical tensions, and an evolving multilateral landscape where the rules-based international order confronts what UN Secretary General António Guterres describes as the encroaching law of the jungle. Today's interactive dialogue, convened by the South African Institute of International Affairs, SAIIA, SALO, and the Institute for Global Dialogue, brings together analysts and experts to assess how South Africa's international relations agenda features in this year's SONA and to interrogate the country's foreign policy posture at this critical juncture. I would now like to invite Philani Mthembu, Executive Director of the Institute for Global Dialogue, for some welcoming remarks.
Good morning, colleagues. It's really great that we're convening here in Cape Town post the State of the Nation address, an address which came at a quite an opportune, time with the 30th anniversary of the South Africa's Constitution, but also at a time where I think the international order continues to face various changes, and South Africa seeks to reposition itself within that changing geopolitical landscape. It also came at a point where the country is preparing for its local government elections in an environment where we've seen greater political competition domestically. So I think, colleagues, it's really good to have this event, especially collaboratively with the South African Institute of International Affairs and, of course, the Southern African Liaison Office, institutions that were all quite heavily involved within South Africa's G20 presidency. I think if we only look at the international relations dimensions of the State of the Nation address, whether it was about South Africa holding firm on its principles outlined in its G20 presidency, whether it's the AU Peace and Security Council or South Africa chairing SADC this year, whether we look at the African Continental Free Trade Area, and other dimensions that were announced yesterday, including the withdrawal of our troops from MONUSCO. I think what is important for me is that the State of the Nation address took place in an environment where South Africa understands that if it is to continue to play an effective role in international relations, it has to rebuild its capabilities at home. It cannot play an effective role abroad if its capabilities at home are diminished. And I think that was quite important. So whether it was discussions on water, whether it was discussions on infrastructure, discussions on the economy, the ability of South Africa to effectively tackle those challenges will also have a direct impact on its ability to play an effective role internationally. And I think today's discussion will help us to unpack some of those dimensions. We're very grateful that we joined by the chair of the Portfolio Committee on International Relations, Honorable Supra Mahumapelo, who has worked with our respective institutions as the Portfolio Committee consistently. And I think what we have seen also in recent years is that Parliament also has an important role to play when it comes to shaping South African foreign policy, but also when it comes to an oversight role over our commitments in international relations. And so, colleagues, with that, I wish to welcome you today. I look forward to today's discussion as we unpack the various dimensions that were outlined in the State of the Nation address and what implications they will have on South Africa's foreign policy. Thank you, colleagues.
I now invite Molly Dlamini, board member from the Southern Africa Liaison Office, for some welcome remarks.
Good morning, to everyone. I'd like to firstly honor the presence of the chairperson of the International Relations Portfolio Committee in Parliament, Ntate Supra, Ntate Ubakeng Raitumela Utlile. I'd like to greet the ambassadors present, former ambassadors. There's Ambassador Berry Gilda at the back. Greetings to the diplomats in the house. Ambassador Ruby Marx also in the house. Greetings to colleagues from the civil society that are present, academics, and other citizens of the city of Cape Town and other areas, and the whole bigger family of SALO. We are pleased to be having this discussion. Moreover, that we are going to be having it in partnership, SALO, SAIIA, IGD. More than ever before, we do need to be together as we make an analysis of these regional dynamics that we see, these global dynamics that we see, the tensions that we talk about globally. So we are very pleased that you are here. What we heard in the SONA is that South Africa continues to be seized with issues of Africa development, Africa regional integration. The president covered such issues, and we hope that in this global arena that we have entered, the African continent will also be seized with ensuring that Africa develops the way it's supposed to be, and that Africa integrates. I'm glad that last week in Ghana there was a very important meeting that was held that was about promoting intra-Africa trade. So we hope that since the president has lifted that up, we'll see more of that. We even know that there's something new that is called Pan-African Payment Systems that has been established by AFTA in Ghana, since the secretariat is in Ghana. And we just hope all different financial institutions and central banks of different African countries can be able to subscribe to that, considering all these dynamics that are brought about by what we would want to now say is realism in the space of international relations, where you have to really promote self-reliance. And self-reliance would also mean being able to do certain things without having to rely on others. And we believe that there's a space that we're in. With those few words, we'd like to once again welcome you, and also welcome all those that are online, that have joined online. And thank IGD and SAIIA. SAIIA will also be talking about the new publications, and Gustavo will say more about that as well as he joins this high table. Thank you very much. Good morning to all of you.
Allow me to now invite Gustavo de Carvalho from SAIIA for the concluding welcome remarks.
Good morning, and perhaps I could just say ditto. And that is a great concluding remarks, because thank you, Pilani, thank you, Molly. But what I wanted to do, because you're going to hear from me a little bit more today, is really first to welcome all of you that are here in Cape Town, joining us for this event. And really my remarks is about thanks. And I think it has to do a lot, I think what Pilani was mentioning earlier, in terms of in a place that is as diverse and has such a complexity within its society, within its economy, within its politics, creating spaces for partnerships like this is fundamentally important for us. We often see things differently. We often see the world with different lenses, with different backgrounds, with different approaches, different areas of expertise. But really this event, when we started talking about this in the margins of the T20 last year, was really to how do we create
a space and an opportunity for us to have a chat, to have a conversation. In a way, we've been saying for the last few days that what we want for most of today, it is to have more like a podcast, less of a panel. That in a way really highlights one of the things. I'm originally from Brazil, but I've been in South Africa for almost 20 years now. And one of the things that I love the most in this country is that we have not only a democracy, but we have a very loud democracy. There is a lot of voices, there is a lot of views, and that's what makes it so difficult for us working in this field to fully understand, but also what makes it so fascinating for us to understand how this country can make the best of it and to place the country, the region, and the continent in a better footing internationally and domestically. So first, to thanks once again IGD and SALO. It's always a pleasure working with you guys. This is more than a partnership, this is a friendship. I think there is a lot of friendships in this room, and I think that really says. I also wanted to, from our side at SAIIA, there's also internal partnerships. And that is important for us in institutions when we work in silos. That is important to reach out to the office next door. And really to thank our Cape Town office. We're doing this from our Johannesburg office, that our program on African governance and diplomacy, but also our futures program at SAIIA that is hosted here in Cape Town. Because what we identified is that it's important to have these discussions, but we all seasoned people, we've seen this rodeo before, we've been part of these conversations, but it's important to give a voice and a space for our upcoming stars, and here Lita and Karabo, that have written two fascinating pieces in relation to democracy in Africa and digital public infrastructure. And we really wanted to give them this platform to launch the paper, to find some insights, but really to bridge some of those conversations. And that will help us in our discussion a little bit later on how do we bring some of those issues and what is the relevance of them within the context of SONA. And in that regard, I think it's important to also recognize our partners, our funders, that really allow these papers to be published, our salaries to be paid, the lights to be on, and in this case, particularly the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, my apologies for my terrible German, who's really been working with SAIIA for a long time, and particularly in an initiative that looks into a regional outlook, particularly within the SADC region, and looking for options, alternatives, and spaces around that. You will see some QR codes for the papers there that you can have a look. Our two authors are here, so feel free to grab them at the end and have conversations, and perhaps during the main session to bring insights on that. But the final thank you, I think, that I wanted to make here, sorry, before the final thank you, but also thanking the Open Society Foundations that is also funding a part of this process, also been working with us very closely, helping us to providing the means that allow us to think about where is the world going, and that is a fundamental question. Final point that I wanted to do before I close here is perhaps a more of a geographical thanks. Many of us here are based in Gauteng. Most of you are based here in Cape Town. And I think we often underestimate how important this conversation between not only the two largest urban centers in the country, but also the two political hubs within this country, that we need to do this more. Us from Gauteng coming here to Cape Town, but you from Cape Town also coming to Gauteng to make this discussion more meaningful, diverse, and with different voices, perspectives, and views. Thank you once again. All protocols observed, and I wish a very interesting discussion, not only for us here in the room, but also for the over 200 people that are currently online. We had almost 400 people registered, so we believe this number is still going to increase. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the conversations.
Thank you, Gustavo. I would like to now move on to the next segment of our program, and that is the keynote address. And for that, I would like to invite Honorable Supra Mahumapelo, Chairperson of the Portfolio Committee on International Relations and Cooperation.
Keynote. I hope one day I can understand what it means. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. As introduced, my name is Supra Obakeng Ramueletsi Mahumapelo. I'm currently a member of parliament here in Cape Town, representing the African National Congress. Before I came here, I was a premier of a province called Northwest. And before then, I was a speaker of the legislature, chief whip of the ANC in that legislature. On enhancing the intellectual side of my brain, my parents pushed me until I reached a stage where I ended up in the then University of Port Elizabeth and got some paper which is called Masters in Political Economy. Currently doing this and that to try and enhance this little brain which came from with my body from my mother. I greet you all, and I want to thank SALO for affording Parliament this platform. How much time do I have before I cause a disaster? I was just told it's keynote, so there's a high risk embedded in the... Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Once more, I want to thank SALO. Ladies and gentlemen, Parliament of the Republic of South Africa, which is a consequence of the Constitution, whose 30 years we are celebrating this year, basically gives Parliament three cardinal responsibilities. The first one is to make laws. The second one is to provide oversight on the executive. And the third is to ensure public participation. That responsibility, which is enshrined in the Constitution, extends to ancillary bodies of Parliament, which is the portfolio committees of Parliament, which operate based on the rules. The rules are also a consequence or a creature of the Constitution because they have to be constitutional. If they are not, they can be challenged in court because we are a democracy here in South Africa. So, the portfolio committee, many people don't know that for you to become a chair of a portfolio committee, the portfolio committee is given powers by Parliament through the rules to elect from among members of Parliament. It means from the 400, we can only elect from a certain number allocated from to a committee. We are 11 in the international relations, and for whatever good and bad reasons, the committee decided to elect me as its chairperson. But currently we are in the era of a phenomenon referred to as the government of national unity. Whether it will permanently exist as a feature in the politics of South Africa, we don't know. It's up to the voters to decide that particular matter. Now, arising from what the President said yesterday, there's just one point I thought, because I looked at the media coverage and so on, it's not properly articulated and explained. It's just one point. I'm picking up from the speech of the President, that South Africa will not be bullied. So I just thought I must give a context to what does that mean. In the first place, it means that our sovereignty is sacrosanct. So our sovereignty is anchored on our own people, on our tenets of democracy as a state, and therefore we will not allow other member states to encroach and undermine our sovereignty. That's number one, my understanding. Number two, our sovereignty means that we see ourselves as an integral part of a global world. In that global world, we are an integral part of a perspective of multilateralism. That is why South Africa subscribes to bodies of global governance. And the third one is the fact that because we are a sovereign state, we are a consequence of the actions of the people through democratic means, and therefore we put at the center of what we do as a democratic state the people. So we are people-centered. That is why things will be taken to court, come back to court, we must consult, and all those things is because we are people-centered and anchored. Number 4, this bullying in my view should mean that we reciprocate as a sovereign state. It means those things that enhance our standing at the global level, at the regional level, at the continental level, at the local level, and they are in the interest of South Africans. We will do reciprocation as a state among member states. Number 5 is that we act in the context of mutual interests. But our mutual interests are not neutral. I will make an example. We are Pan-Africanist in outlook. In South Africa, we subscribe to Pan-Africanism. That is why partly we are members of the African Union, which is a baby coming from the Organization of African Unity, whose decision on these matters of borders, which I don't have time to deal with, we will deal with one day when SALO can organize another gathering, because the time has come to ask a question as to whether the decisions taken in 1844-45 and endorsed later by the OAU in as far as the borders are concerned, in the current conjuncture of geopolitics and where we are as a continent, South Africa, whether we have not arrived at a time to review that decision. And the body that exists to look at that decision is the African Union. My own view, not the view of Parliament or of the ANC, is that, or not of the ANC, is that the time has come for us to review that decision, because, as I will come later, it has contributed and is contributing to some of the problems we have. Instead of having continental sovereignty, we are in enclaves of member states within the continent's sovereignty, which then brings friction among ourselves and is exploited by many other forces at play. And some of those forces are powerful forces globally, which are coming externally to deal a lot of shenanigans in the African continent, including going to the extent of giving a terminology to what is embedded naturally in Africa and in South Africa as critical mineral resources. That terminology doesn't come from Africa. This terminology of critical mineral resources is not from here. It's not from South Africa. It's not from anywhere in the world. It's a terminology engineered, concocted outside the country, but about our own continent. And we have uncritically fallen into that terminology. We embrace it, and it's into our vocab, it's into our laws, it's into our policies. The question will be, why is Africa unable to do its own characterization on what is embedded within the earth in Africa? Number 7 on bullying is that we realize the fact that we are interconnected, and our interconnectedness to the rest of the world. This is what President Ramaphosa is explaining to all and sundry. Our interconnectedness must not be interpreted to mean timidity. So timidity is not embedded in our understanding of our sovereignty and how we are interconnected to the rest of the world. Number 8 is that we will at all material times understand that our sovereignty is integrated and embedded in the sovereignty of the African continent. Let me go to another subject. You will remember, ladies and gentlemen, something which President slightly alluded to yesterday. The African Union had taken a decision that their theme for 2025 is on reparations. We were interrogating this matter as a committee on Wednesday. And I have made a proposal which I'm making here, and I hope that SALO can, from a research point of view, assist us to interrogate this proposal which I made. I had suggested to the committee, and the committee has accepted my proposal, that our sovereignty, which is embedded in our quest for reparation by the former colonizers, must be anchored not only on monetary terms, but that it has to be anchored on, among other things, the AU agreeing with the European Union on how the European Union is going to develop a special dispensation for the funding of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. That's number one. Number two, that we should engage the European Union plus UK as the former colonizers in Africa to look at trade with the former colonized, not on an equal basis or an equal footing. And one of the solutions is embedded in currencies. I'll make an example. The euro, the pound, compared to the rand, there's a huge disparity. So my argument in the committee was that as part of reparation, we must engage the European Union to agree with them that that disparity between our currency and our currencies must become a form of reparation. It means Europe plus UK must accept that they must lose that profit which is embedded in the differences in the currency for trading. So when we trade with them, they must forgo the difference in currencies. And that difference in currencies will then be a form of reparation, instead of them giving us money physically. That is a special dispensation that we could discuss with the European Union. Thirdly, I suggested to the committee, and we have agreed, and I hope SALO will engage with us on that particular matter. We have suggested that Africa Month must go beyond songs, music, dance, food. They're important, right? I'm not saying they're not important. I don't want to be interpreted to be supporting what Honorable Mantasha said in another platform, because I'm an artist and I know the importance of songs, poetry, culture in general. My suggestion is that Africa Month must be dedicated to this matter which the African Union had raised of reparation. Therefore, our proposal is that from now onwards, starting in this May this year, we must discuss, all member states within the AU this year must discuss the essence of the Africa Month and what it must mean economically to Africans in the context of reparations linked to development, infrastructure-wise, and so on. And urge all member states, parliament in Africa, to debate the matter, take a resolution, table it in the African Union. It becomes a program of action. And the same matter which is agreed to in Africa must be tabled in all European parliaments, plus the UK, so that in the AU, UK, EU arrangement, we can agree on what we are going to do going forward in the Africa Month every year to implement some minimum practical program which will address reparations, which was agreed to by the African Union, instead of tangible money coming from the African Union. So, the other matter which I think we need to understand from what the President was saying yesterday is withdrawal from MONUSCO. What does it mean? Other people interpret, I saw some analysts yesterday saying that it means South Africa's influence in the region and in the continent is getting diminished as a consequence of the withdrawal, right? And it can be true. What does it mean? Among other things, it means that South Africa is shifting slightly to more emphasis on investing resources on two things. And one is to ensure that we deepen dialogue more than ever before to deal with conflicts in the African continent, which means better impetus, better outcomes, better, more aggressive engagements involving everybody. The resources must be redirected from physical boots to dialogue in the African continent. But secondly, it means that more focus and resources have to be shifted towards economic relation and uplifting the economies of the countries which are stable, which are unstable, including Congo, in the African continent. And I also want to assist in clarifying what Honorable Mantashe is said to have said at the mining in Daba about Congo and the so-called critical minerals. The context of what we are saying is, as South Africa, in as far as Congo is concerned, and the embeddedness of strategic African minerals in Congo, means that we as South Africa, because we trade with Congo and other African countries, before we allow other external countries to come into play, it will be much better for us to have a dialogue among ourselves about the critical importance of these minerals which are embedded in our continent, have an agreement on them, and how we are going to progressively exploit them to grow our economies, create jobs, deal with inequality as the African continent, and ensure that we have a united approach in as far as engaging with other member states around the world is concerned on how trade between them and the African continent on the minerals should be approached. Instead of being individualistic as member states, combine our efforts, what exists in the African continent, so that it can be win-win for all in the African continent. I thought I must explain that because some media people are saying there's tension between Congo and South Africa as a consequence of that statement. It can be true. When you look at a trade between South Africa and Congo, is growing, is on an upward trajectory. There's a lot of South African companies that are operating in Congo, and I think it will continue to be like that. The last thing which I want to say, because I can see I'm over now, the 10 minutes, it's about the effects of what I characterize as the trumpeting trumpets of the United States of America. I characterize it in that way because those trumpets, their trumpeting are such that when they trumpet, they affect the rest of the world. They undermine multilateralism. They believe in might being right because might must perpetually be right and rule the world. What are the advantages of this trumpeting trumpets? My own view is that this variable in the equation of geopolitics might actually have to occur for some time to come. Because one advantage coming out of this trumpeting trumpets is that it's unifying even forces that were not working together before. They see the importance to now work together. So why must we repel unity? When forces come together and so on, and the consequence is as a consequence of the trumpeting trumpet. So because it brings unity of purpose, of beginning to see things the same, it's better to maintain it. That's my view. The second one is that from the G20, there is the trumpeting trumpets are saying that South Africa must be reduced to nothingness of nothing in geopolitics. What is the advantage in that posture? The advantage is that South Africa, as a consequence of what Trump is doing, has got an opportunity to engage the next chairperson, who is the United Kingdom, to already start discussing, because South Africa is part of the tripartite of the G20. Therefore, it has a platform to engage the UK, to already discuss with the UK on that which arose from Johannesburg, declaration of the G20. How is the UK, because the UK is not opposed to it, how is the UK, because it's going to become the next chair, going to make sure that there's concrete realization of what came out from Johannesburg? That is number one. Number two, because of proximity between the UK and the EU and our relationship as Africa, South Africa with the European Union, what role is the UK going to play in the context of it also working to normalize its economic and political relations with the European Union, and that we will want to play a role there as South Africa and the African Union? Thirdly, the European Union, because of the trumpeting trumpets, cannot move to the east, right? Because it has got some discomforts with the east. It therefore means that the European Union is left with Africa to work with. By and large, it's left with Africa. Therefore, it imposes a responsibility on the European Union to sit down with Africa and say, how do we, in the context of the developing geopolitics, how do we work together to make sure that we build a better Africa and a better world? I want to thank you, SALO, for giving me this opportunity for the opening remarks. Thank you very much.
What a wonderful foundation for the discussions that are about to start. Please, let's give the chairperson another round of applause. I want to just alert you, there will be food available throughout the event. Please feel free to get up, get some food, come back and join the discussions. We're now going to move on to the discussion portions of today's program, and I'd like to invite Karabo Mangena and Lita Mzanyati, the authors of two very important publications, to the Fire Pit for the fireside chat, where we will be discussing the publications. Thanks, Gustavo. Karabo, I'd like to start with your paper. So it's titled Reframing Democracy in Africa, From Ritual to Transformative Solidarity Economics. And I'd like to just highlight to our audience that there are some hard copies going around. So if you would like to grab a copy, please consult our authors. I'm sure they will be able to give you one. Karabo, please tell us a little bit why this paper matters, why it was important for you to write about this topic.
Well, I think, not even I think, democracy is at a decline, and this is something that's been spoken about by every scholar, every author, and everywhere. And I think it was important for us to situate ourselves as Africans and what we want the next system of governance or the government system to look like. So it's important for South Africa and Africans to situate themselves and contextualize what democracy is and stop taking the same model that most European countries are using into the African context, because in that regard, we could be looking great on paper, and then in implementation, it's lacking. Most people are not feeling democracy. They don't even understand what it means. Is it a principle? Is it something that's happening during elections? What is it exactly? So it's important for us to reimagine or redefine what democracy is and what it means to African people. So yeah, at the core of it was just contextualizing democratic governance and making sure that we understand where we are and where we could be as Africans.
Thank you, Karabo. Lita, now about your paper, which is titled Digital Public Infrastructure Futures, Charting Inclusive and Secure Transformation in the SADC region. Please tell us, why does that paper matter, why now, and why the SADC region?
Thanks, Isabel. Good morning. I'm used to saying good morning, colleagues, but it was said that there's diplomats and ambassadors. They're definitely not my colleagues, so I can't say colleagues. I'm standing on existing protocol. My name is Lita Mzinyati. I am a researcher in the Futures program at SAIIA. It is nice to be here. But yeah, coming back to the paper. So India's presidency of the G20 and its focus on DPI sort of moved DPI from being just a technical issue into more of a foreign policy conversation. And with Brazil also taking over that conversation, and when it got to South Africa, it didn't disappear, it lingered in the conversations. And I think that's what made it very important. And I think the most important thing about DPI, especially in the African continent and SADC, we have to get it right. Because if we get it wrong, we risk dependency, we risk foreign surveillance, we risk exploitation. I'm sure we all have an idea of the fight for digital hegemony in the African continent. We have the EU, we have the trumpeting trumpets, we have, so there's different actors. We also have the Chinese. So I think that's what made it very important.
Thanks for that. And I can already see some linkages to the content of last night's State of the Nation address. So I'd like to turn to you again, Karabo, to ask you, looking at your paper, considering what was discussed last night, what's been discussed already this morning, if you could give policy recommendations to government right now based on your paper, what would that be?
I think once again, so my paper argues that democracy in many African countries, including South Africa, risks becoming procedural and focusing on elections and institutional reform and everything without delivering structural transformation, which is what we need at the core of it, right? Because if democracy becomes ritualistic and not transformative, then its legitimacy erodes. The question isn't about elections being relevant or if they matter. They do, but they're not sufficient. And in that case, we need something that's going to restore legitimacy, and that is transformation. And what does this mean for policy implications? Well, firstly, we need to re-anchor democratic legitimacy into material transformation. If democracy remains electoral, but inequality remains structurally intact, legitimacy erodes. So how do we do this? By embedding redistribution and structural reform. That means your energy transition, industrial policy, food system, local economic performance in the matrix of democracy. We move from measuring democratic health through procedural compliance to measuring it through transformative or transformation outcomes, because leadership in Africa requires moral authority, and moral authority depends on material things and not necessarily on procedures. So yeah.
Thank you. Alita, same question to you. There was some focus last night in the address on digital public infrastructure, or DPI. If you could drop off a dossier with some policy recommendations based on your paper, what would that be?
Thanks, Isabel. So the president yesterday made a lot of mention on technology. And I remember standing over my TV, I'm like, okay, but what about technology? It was like technology to fight crime, technology to, but what are we talking about? And then he eventually went onto his section of the speech where he spoke a lot about DPI, which I was very excited about. So I've jotted a few things down so that I don't waste time. So the first one for me would be developing and publishing a national and regional DPI strategy that is linked to foreign policy. So how this would look like is, for example, treat DPI as a strategic infrastructure and not just as an ICT reform project. And also it would look like combining the Department of Communications, Home Affairs, because he also spoke about Home Affairs having digital IDs and everything, DIRCO, and the Department of Trade to have the same positioning on DPI when engaging outside. So have a coordinated digital positioning. And then also explicitly integrate DPI into South Africa's African Union and SADC engagements. And I think that will set us as agenda setters and not just being reactionary in our policies. And I also think it's important to note that when it comes to digitization, time is very important because it moves very quickly. So we want to find ourselves in an agenda setting position. And then the second one is strengthening the governance guardrails. So the first thing that comes to mind there is ratifying the AU Malabo Convention and also ensuring robust data protection frameworks in South Africa. And also the president mentioned that South Africa is championing regional integration through SADC and also the AU. With that, I would say there should be mutual recognition of digital identity standards and also the harmonization of data protection frameworks and also mutual recognition of digital IDs. And also I think one of the main things that's closest to my heart when it comes to DPI is civic education. People have to know what DPI is, and the president mentioned that people will be able to get services without going to the necessary branches and all of that. They'll be able to get that online. But there has to be enough civic education so that people don't feel like the government has just disappeared from people just because the buildings are not there, because at some point it will get to that. So we have to make sure that there's enough education on what DPI is, what it entails, what are people's rights, because digital rights are human rights. So we have to make sure that there's enough education on that. Thanks.
We're going into the final 5 minutes of our conversation. Alita, and I want to ask you as a follow-up, you focus a lot on the Malabo Convention in your paper. Can you give us a brief overview of why it is so important in this instance, and is there more work that needs to be done in South Africa domestically to align with its principles, even though it still needs to be ratified?
Yeah. So thanks again for that. So in South Africa, we do have we have a good foundational base in terms of data protection actions and policies and all of that. I think it's a matter of South Africa is a big player in the global stage when it comes to African countries. So I think South Africa ratifying the AU Malabo Convention would do a lot for digital rights. It would do a lot for data protection because at the moment there's not enough of that. And if we do have a framework or a policy that addresses those things, then it is important for it to be ratified and used, also not just for outside trade, but also intra-Africa trade. I think it's very important. So yeah.
Thanks for that. And then, Karabo, closing remarks. In your earlier response, you mentioned that there's a lot of confusion around what democracy is and what does it mean. So I would like to ask you, what does democracy mean to you?
I love this question, actually. So to me, democracy is a principle. It is a principle that helps us redistribute power, resources, and even understand the pluralism that needs to be there in different policies and how we govern ourselves, especially as Africans. We're so rich in culture and diversity, and we need to harmonize that in a sense and make sure that everyone's rights are protected. And so at its core, it is a principle that needs to be embedded in every sector, whether it's the economy, in our viewing of mining, actually with mining in Dam as well. That's something that should be embedded in. So you need to benefit from your land in a sense. So yeah.
Thank you. Please give our authors a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. I am now going to hand over to Gustavo for the interactive dialogue, and there we really encourage audience participation. So if you have a burning question or a comment as the session goes, Gustavo will explain to you how you can interact. Thank you.
So while I wait for, not my speakers, but my friends, we're going to be chatting here. So let me just introduce you, Loazi Somia from SALO and Sanusha Naidu from IGD. And what we're going to do for the next hour is really, as I mentioned in the opening remarks, is really to have a conversation around SONA and some of the interesting things, directions, signals, absences, both of individuals but also of topics, and to link it quite directly not only to South African foreign policy, but particularly to find a way to see how the space and the evolution of the current global environment and how much that affects even topics and discussions that are fundamentally seen as domestic. And I think if we look into the fireside chats and all of those aspects, Lita presented that quite openly, that it is if we look into DPI as a foreign policy issue, it's not because we're overstretching the concept, but fundamentally, there is a geopolitical competition and a geoeconomic competition that is fundamentally about standards, that is about technology, it is about new approaches. But also, I think in what Karabo was mentioning, that I think is very important, there is often an obsession with events within democratic spaces, and particularly elections, as the beginning and end of what democracy is. And that is fundamentally problematic, but we also need to understand that democracies are based on signals that are provided, trends, directions. And I think the state of the nation, to a large degree, it's not about a lot of the novelties that are presented, the big announcements. It's fundamentally about what is the trajectory, the spaces, the areas in which the state is presenting to its society, what do we need to watch for, what do we need to be cautious for, and how do we look back and look forward. And I wanted to start our chat on that, and perhaps ask a very open-ended question to my two friends here on how did you see that signaling happening yesterday? Sanusha, maybe you can kickstart and we will interject, intervene, engage with from here.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm a bit sleepy. And it's not because it's boring, it's just that I'm really tired.
So you were there, like we left, Sanusha, myself and Isabel, we were at SONA yesterday. Yeah. And we left at almost 11 o'clock. You were still on the studio, so
Yeah. Well, welcome everyone, and to the chair, who's now not here, but I think he raised some very interesting points. But to come back to your issue, I think the opening statement of that SONA was quite interesting, the way the president framed it in these periodic historical narratives. And I'm hoping some of my colleagues here who follow the democratic process will kind of unpack that, because he started off around the 1956, the women's thing. He carried on with that kind of historical narrative, which kind of intertwines with this human rights but the democracy question. True. And, you know, he spoke about District 6, which was really important. 60 years of dispossession in District 6 based on a dispossession of human rights, an apartheid system that systematically and politically, economically dispossessed people, right? And that for me was interesting. So he never kind of went to the point of saying, well, 36 years and a day, Mandela stood at the same city hall after walking out of Victor Verster prison, and I was there holding the mic while he addressed the grand parade, right? He never did that. But he went through these historical narratives. And if you look at the banners, I don't know if it was shown on TV, but if you look at the banners that were out in there, you had the 60 years of District 6, you had Commonwealth, you had 30 years of the Constitution. But there wasn't that vibe around Mandela standing there 36 and one day. You know, on the
Mandela
11th
wasn't
of
even
February,
mentioned.
right? It wasn't there. And I want to come back to this question of how does this link up to where we are 30 years after the Constitution has been adopted by Parliament, which is, if you look at the Constitution and the rights-based approach to the Constitution and the legislation of that rights-based approach, it's something that Karabo said, which really struck me, and it goes back to the negotiations, and we have some ambassadors in the room who were part of those negotiations, who probably had a bird's eye view than we did. I was a student in '94, you know, and we were excited because here was this whole CODESA. But then years later, you start hearing this, it wasn't going according to plan. There were all of these different tensions around the negotiations, and the key principal negotiator being President Ramaphosa at the time, you know, you had these tensions and all of that. So I think the challenge we had in what we saw yesterday was whether this democracy is coming full circle around the negotiations of this democracy. And why was it negotiated in the way that it was? And what were the political rights versus the socio-economic transformative rights? And if you look at democratic theory, Adam Pawlowski, you look at democratization theory, my sense is that it's a principle, it's necessary, but it's not always sufficient.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge, because you now have to think about what that democracy is. And it's a democracy that is built on the expectation of what was going to be the transition. Never happened. And so when you look at the when you look at the speech, I mean, what was the '94 democratic process about when people stood in their lines? I was very lucky to be part of that. People were standing in lines saying, I want a house, I want a flushing toilet, I want access to water. But these were townships that also became militarized. And that scared me yesterday. And for those of you who were at the Mail and Guardian event earlier, Angela Fick made this point very interestingly, is you talk about an SANDF, and then you suddenly have all of the stuff which is almost the opposite of what this democracy was about, right? So it's a fundamental question where security is not just about security against crime. It's about security of livelihood. It's about security of engagement. And that speech, I think, captured that in that way. But this is not a South African problem only. It's a global problem. There is a pushback against democracy around the world. And I was wondering in the paper that Karabo did was looking at the youth and how they are pushing back. I mean, I make this I think people are tired of hearing me say what the Gen Zs did in East Africa, around how they took control of this against leaders that are 60, 70 years old, who don't want to leave office, geriatrics in their own right. But the point about it is that, are we thinking about what that democracy means for them? What is their interpretation of democracy? And there's something happening very fundamental in South Africa around our democracy. People are frustrated because there's an expectation that democracy equates this kind of governance. Not true. Doesn't happen. Even in the most developed economies, it's not there. It's not, I mean, you come from Brazil, right, Gustavo? So you can give us a great lesson in how democracy is evolving and what people are thinking and a lot of
what not to do
and what not to do. But when does democracy become really relevant? Well, let's take the water issue. When the middle class don't get water in their taps, the poor sit at the coalface of it all the time. But the moment the middle class doesn't get anything, they are frustrated. There's a water protest. There are all of these town hall debates, and so that tells you when democracy matters. And I found that interesting in the speech yesterday, because one of the things about South Africa's democratization is that it was about this debate of whether it was procedural, we tick boxes, whether it was about whether we do the political rights, or whether we do the combination of the social, economic, and the political rights. But then it comes back to the market. It comes back to your economic model and how that defines you. So if you think about Huntington's third wave of democratization, when does it start to take root in terms of pushing against the system? Is when the middle class realizes, hang on, my rights are being violated in a democracy. When I walk around and I have these major kinds of depots of waste around my community, when the criminal element is now sitting in my community, when you're sitting and you're not getting access to electricity, and of course some people are claiming that the water issue that the president mentioned and the whole kind of, the agency and the fact that there was this thing about, now he's going to take control, even though the deputy president was whatever. It comes to this point about what the middle class is going to do and who stands up and listens. So the poor are the poor. They're constantly fighting for survival, but their voices are not heard until it reaches this zenith in that space. And I'll stop there.
It's always difficult speaking of the Sanusha. It's a really tough act to follow. But
you should just say ditto.
Ditto. Yesterday's State of the Nation address was very interesting on multiple levels. So I'll go ahead and compare it to last year's State of the Nation address. Last year's State of the Nation address was the "We Will Not Be Bullied" speech by President Ramaphosa, where it was a highly foreign policy heavy State of the Nation address. It's laying the foundations to South Africa's G20 presidency and laying the foundations to South Africa's prioritization of foreign policy. On the other hand, this year was a different State of the Nation address. Whilst there were aspects around foreign policy that were mentioned around issues around UNESCO, South Africa's role within the African, in fact, he didn't go very detailed around South Africa's role within Africa, because South Africa this year and the next 2 years is playing major roles within the African continent. We are members of the African Peace and Security Council. We are chairing SADC. We are currently leading the Continental Infrastructure Program, and we're also leading on various aspects about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Especially concerning the regional integration aspects, which was barely touched on, but very, very critical and important points concerning South foreign policy trajectory. But this speech this year was a shift in South Africa's perception around what the totality of the democracy and human rights and foreign policy ambit is. Traditionally, we always project the soft power around human rights, democracy as a foundational and crux basis of our diplomatic engagements internationally. But what we begin to see now is economic development, trade, and as the foundational basis of our international engagement. and the utilization of foreign policy as a means towards attaining those domestic pressure points. Because for far too long, people on the streets have been questioning, what are we doing internationally? How does it benefit me as an individual? And I think now the foreign policy trajectory, as highlighted within the president's speech, is a means of trying to answer that question. Whether or not it is sufficient is a question all left up into the air. Because you need an entire whole of government approach towards both the industrialization aspects around your country, along with the operation of your foreign policy. As long as you do not have a whole of government approach towards that, you'll be failing on one level or another. And I think this democracy project now lays on two legs in my eyes. One, whether or not the people see the dividends of democracy. We must forget the procedural things, because people are becoming more and more disillusioned with the procedural aspects around democracy. People are looking at the substantive dividends of democracy, especially the poor and working class people of this country. As you've seen the voter turnouts and the electoral participation in the last general elections, local government elections, people are, even though they are frustrated, they're not turning out in the numbers you would expect them to, because they are not receiving the dividends of democracy. The second aspect is that whether or not this GNU will continue like this, and how it can be structured, because there are a number of concessions that the president has made within the State of the Nation address, especially concerning trying to save John Steenhuisen's butt by recovering his competence during the speech. So those considerations were also present within that speech. But the fundamental consideration is what legacy will he leave, because this is his final year. We're heading into 2027, will be a very shaky year in terms of ANC electoral politics. What legacy will he leave as the head of state under the ANC leadership? And post-ANC leadership, what legacy will he leave as the head of state of South Africa? So those are the questions that came to mind when he was busy articulating his State of the Nation address.
You know that John Steenhuisen said in an interview after the address that nobody bullies him. Yeah. Right? He does the bullying. But I want to make a point that Luwazi raised very importantly, and that is how important the democratization project was for South Africa in terms of the international influence. Yeah. I mean, if you want to be really honest, we've played that role to international. And the influence of of external actors and stakeholders, and even in the apartheid state, post 1994. I mean, one of the things that struck me as really interesting about the democratization, and I know we're not talking foreign policy here, but it was part of the foreign policy of the stakeholders under the apartheid state, who were in business, who were in sport, who were going to Lusaka and visiting and negotiating. Now, there's a sense that democratization in South Africa was built both in terms of what was around the Freedom Charter, but it was also built around what international capital wanted. We can't ignore that, because you're seeing this now in the context of what that speech said yesterday, in terms of we have a crisis in terms of employment, the growth is not sufficient. Growth was never sufficient. I mean, there's a group of theorists who call it not the gross domestic product, they call it the gross domestic problem. And that GDP problem is because the model that we're now seeing unravel globally has been what we played to. We've adopted it. And one of the things was very interesting when they were negotiating the macroeconomic strategy. They didn't have a strategy on the economy. It was like almost like trying to understand that this was what international capital wanted. This is how we negotiated it. And part of that is coming back to haunt the ANC. I'm not going to say the GNU, I'm going to say the ANC. Because it's coming back to haunt the fact that you have this kind of oxymoron around what was the social economic transformation, but you didn't do it because you aligned to the neoliberal, which was in a state of crisis nevertheless. And that's coming home to roost.
You say we're not talking foreign policy, but I want to, because I think every year when we're watching SONA, I think especially for us working on international relations, we often like how much foreign policy was there. And we know that it's usually the last portion of the speech. Some years, like last year, there was a lot of mentioning. I think last year there was issues with the United States, there was issue of the G20 presidency and all of those issues. And I think at a surface, it seems that foreign policy was very light. And Loazi, we were chatting just before we started with Pilani earlier. It felt to me that foreign policy was kind of pretty much everywhere, either as a constrainer or as an enabler. When discussions on the economy were being made, and really a very direct attempt of showcasing there is a turnaround of the economy. I think the question now is, yes, we can find in many of those indicators that there is a shift in terms of where we have been perhaps for the last decade and a half, but it's fundamentally talking about many structural issues that are related to a global process of diversification and looking for new partners, for guarantee of new supply chains or emerging supply chains, which Africa is positioning itself very strongly around this, that is not just about our critical minerals, and we need to create a better process of beneficiation or added value, or whatever we want to call it. When we're talking about issues related to investments, Transnet, we're looking into some of those global players that are looking into different trade routes and some of the choke points that there is a geographical aspect that South Africa has that simply we're not part of a choke point. We're not Suez, we're not Panama, we're not Bab el-Mandab, we're not Hormuz, we're not Malacca. These are the 5 big trade choke points that one can identify globally, that when you have issues in Suez where all of those vessels were going through the southern tip of Africa, which was a big missed opportunity because that was right in the middle of the peak of the Transnet crisis. But at the end of the day, I think what for me was quite interesting is that there is a soft signaling in terms of, there's no direct mention to the United States. There is a heavily implied, might is right, the trumping trumpets. That wasn't there, but maybe it would have made it a little bit more fun. Whether with the absence of mentioning to BRICS. Even SADC, it's mentioned many times, there's no mention of the presidency. The AU is kind of, that in a way I thought it was quite interesting, because for me what it felt, and I really wanted to see what you think, and I'm gonna open for some comments just now, in terms of how do you see the foreign policy aspects within that? Was there anything that struck you to like, I wasn't really expecting this, or this is a new take, or there was a bold move, or there was a cautious move? I really would like, maybe let me start with Loazi here.
Yeah. So for me, what was most interesting and fascinating was so before the State of the Nation address, the President announced the withdrawal of MINUSCO, and he obviously gave his justification around the restructuring of the South African National Defence Force. But when you go to the State of the Nation address, the justification follows an economic argument on recapitalizing and restructuring the South African National Defence Force, also with the realization that we didn't give much context on why we are withdrawing. So it happens in the context where the DRC has entered 2 negotiation channels, one with the United States and the other with the Qataris concerning the situation in the east of DRC. So outside of the context, South Africa as a peace and security actor there was left with just soldiers there, and we're paying more and more money to keep them there. But that rationality does not follow through in many of the speeches and public sentiments that are made by the policymakers.
Can I ask you, sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to ask a quick question on this. To what degree, and if we look into the MONUSCO case, there's certainly a local element into that. The role of SNDF, the priorities of foreign policy, but it's certainly a response also to the states of multilateralism and particularly of peacekeeping operations, which is not only arguably, I think it's factually, it's on a major credibility, financial, and capacity crisis.
Exactly, because currently the African peace and security architecture is in dire crisis. Similar to how we're experiencing a crisis in the UN Security Council, the African Peace and Security Council itself is understrapped in terms of financial resources. There's no commitment by state actors to commit actual soldiers and hardware on the ground. There's no post-conflict rehabilitation strategy at play at both the regional and continental level. We've undercapacitated our regional research institutions, including how we now deal with the development post-conflict of these regions. This aspects of it also picks on how we do conduct regional integration and how we continue to perpetuate this violent Africa, because what is happening, external powers are now moving into the African continent. There's no common consensus on how do we deal with the issues of these critical minerals as the new rush for Africa is emerging. And at a fundamental level, we as South Africa are unable to provide the necessary peace and security support for our neighbors as we traditionally have done due to the underfunding of the SANDF. So at a domestic level, the fiscal situation itself highly undermines South Africa's soft power and the ability to generate any hard or soft power at a regional and continental level on the basis that the economics of the country do not allow, and the austerity measures being implemented over the last 15 years have severely undercut and South Africa's ability to move the region and continent with it. Now we're entering the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. I highly doubt we'll make any headway in that institution on the basis that we do not have none of the necessary diplomatic tools to have the institution moving. And at a regional level, maybe at a trade level, we'll be able to move some of the Titanic deck chairs around. But we need to have we need to put our money where our mouth is when it comes to issues of this region. But unfortunately, with the austerity budgets, we've seen DIRCO being undercapacitated. We have lack of diplomatic staff being stationed internationally. Only recently we will be deploying more ambassadors. Our economic diplomacy strategy is incongruent because business sector is doing one thing, then DTIC is doing another thing, and then DIRCO is doing another thing. So we have these multiple factors that needs to be in synthesis in order for whatever the president has said yesterday to come to a reality, especially if we want to lead at a SADC level, especially if we want to reshape the African peace and security architecture, and if we want to support and drive regional and continental industrialization, development, and integration.
I mean, I think in a way, the sense of the foreign policy context in the speech was really around the trade. It was around the investment. It was around industrial policy. How do we create the kind of growth trajectory after acknowledging that growth is not the your only kind of integrator into the economy. And perhaps the challenge is, in a world that is now currently in such a kind of volatile situation, where are you going to be opening up those markets?
Yeah.
And it ties into this idea of whether the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is one of those issues where you start to think about the level of synthesis. But it also requires, and this is where I think I would have liked to have seen in the State of the Nation address yesterday, is if you're talking about a more efficient bureaucracy, you also need a more efficient foreign policy white paper that defines your foreign policy strategy, but also your bureaucracy in foreign policy. Because I think there is a report of an oversight visit that the committee led by the chair did in late November, or no, not, it was during the social summit, just before the social summit. And that report highlights some very frightening things about, we talk about a bureaucracy in South Africa that's not responding to the state. Think about the bureaucracy in the missions. Think about the missions themselves. And one of the things I found interesting in the speech, so it wasn't done in a kind of direct way. It was implicitly kind of navigated in the rhetoric of the speech, right? On the investment and whatever. But it would have been nice to have said, well, We're doing this across the board. We're not just doing it where local government municipal managers now are going to get caught for auditing lifestyles and this, or the SAPS people, or whatever. But you needed to look at this in a more holistic way in terms of how it ties into what your domestic is, because your domestic is critical to who you put in your missions. How are they branding South Africa? And that's the other issue. The branding of South Africa in terms of how you're going to get that investment, how you're going to open up those export markets. The other point I think is very important in terms of the speech, which I think looked at creating a property company, a state property company, right? That's important because you've got a lot of derelict buildings in South Africa under DPW, which is being hijacked, etc. So I was asked to give a comment, and I said, well, I would like to see if this is going to extend to the foreign missions.
Yeah.
Because you've got buildings, and that's another thing on oversight for Parliament, is that they have now, after the New York debacle, right? The New York debacle was just too much, where they bought a building, but they were not using it. It was a derelict building.
And sorry, if you don't know what the New York debacle is, just Google it. There's a lot about it.
So that was the first time the committee went on this oversight. They figured this thing out. They said, wow, what's going on here? But this comes back to why we are renting properties overseas as well when we have properties. So you need management of these things. So it's not just whether you professionalize a foreign service. You've got to think about whether or not these 57 vacancies of ambassadors, including China, by the way, which is supposed to be very important for us because we've just signed a framework agreement on trade and investment and export, duty-free, market-free access, and all kinds of lovely things. But do you have an ambassador that's leading this, negotiating this? You don't. No. And that's a vacant position. How many other vacant positions are you having where you're trying to have an export-led growth model, which, by the way, we know doesn't really work because the principles of WTO still apply. And the SACU issue is even more complicated because you can't apply duty-free, market-free access to South Africa because of the common external issue on SACU. But you don't have your foreign policy that, to me, it seems as if your bureaucracy is now separated in terms of domestic, and then we're not sure we'll tackle foreign policy bureaucracy, but we'll do it in a way that, this whatever. And then let me be facetious on the withdrawal of the troops from the DRC.
Yeah.
The outcry domestically on the troops that died in the DRC. The fact that people were like, what are you doing in the DRC? There was no public diplomacy on this. I wonder if this was not the response in a local government election year. Let's withdraw the troops.
Just two things. I think first, I think it was very interesting when you mentioned the G20 social that I saw some traumas coming on Loazi and like he was sweating a little bit. So apologies for reminding you of how hard your life was last year dealing with that big event. But I think you mentioned something interesting. I'm doing this as a segue to open the floor to you. There is often this debate within the continent that from a normative point of view and from a policy point of view, there is a sense that we have a lot of those. The African Union is very progressive when it comes to its policies, to its ideas, and it often has to do with implementation. And I think what both of you mentioned has to do with that as well. At times, the devil is in those bureaucratic details. It's how do we think about vertically how within an institution like DIRCO, like DOD, like any other department, but particularly across them, including in peacekeeping operations, the role of the National Office for the Coordination of Peace Missions within DIRCO is in principle providing a lot of that coordination, but it's often really challenged around this kind of multi-departmental coordination. And I think it is something certainly for us really to reflect that is the issue of our foreign policy about the depth or quality, the timeliness of our national framework on national interest, or how do we implement, reflect, and do that on a daily basis? And for me, it has a lot to do with the fact that often we're very reactive rather than proactive on the ways in which that we deal with some of the crises, some of the issues around that. I just wanted to open for a brief round of comments, and I'm going to give the floor to 4 people that I'm seeing here. I'm going to beg you to be concise, direct. It can be a comment, can be a question. I will open a second round. And if I can ask Alia over here. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then I'll open later for another round. And just please be concise.
Sure. Hello, everyone. It's good to see all of you again, and I'm sure everybody's appreciated the kind of enriching conversation. My name is Ali Vaiz. I'm an independent political and security risk analyst. I wanted to kind of question, you know, throughout your statements, you've mentioned a certain kind of self-sufficiency that was really evident throughout President Cyril Ramaphosa's speech yesterday, you know, focus on capacity building, domestic economy, etc. My question is, how does this juxtapose with what we're seeing in terms of an emphasis on diversification of partnerships, right? We're talking about, and I you know, yes, I hear that, you know, there was mention of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, but I'm thinking more largely, you know, in the sense of South Africa being really branded as a middle power, and we really saw that at the World Economic Forum, and Sanusha mentioned branding, right? South Africa was quote-unquote branded as open for business. So where are you, you know, what do you think, how should DIRCO, how should, you know, as Luazi mentioned, how should the whole government approach kind of reflect the need and the urgency for diversification of partnerships, if any, right? You know, when we're seeing a really strong message of self-sufficiency.
Oh, thank you, Gustavo. Good morning. My name is Luko Namnguni. As Sanusha would say, I'm just an ordinary troublemaker.
No, a special one.
A special troublemaker.
So are you, Luaz?
There's something that was said by Mauma Pilo in his opening remarks around our acceptance of the phrase critical minerals. And I think this is something that we need to interrogate, because all minerals are critical in their own way. We used to talk about the gold rush, we spoke about diamonds, we spoke about oil, we spoke about platinum. Now, this broad cover of critical minerals almost creates an amoeba kind of thing, that you don't know what you are talking about. Which aspect of critical minerals are you talking about? Which ones do we have? Which ones don't we have? And I think it's creating an interesting global dynamic, because I think others are quite clear which components of the so-called critical minerals they are looking for and where they are located. Because part of our problem with the US is actually this, that there are deposits that are uniquely found in South Africa. And we can go all over about, Trump doesn't care about African people, he doesn't even know who they are. He barely cares about the ICJ case. What he cares about is the kind of tariff deal that DTIC does with the US. When DTIC says to us as the public, we can share openly these aspects of the deal, and then there are some aspects of the deal that cannot be shared with the public. And it is in that veil of secrecy of negotiations where we're going to lose the stewardship and governance over this question around critical minerals. Because when the president stands, he's effectively saying South Africa is a 40 trillion rands problem. It's a problem, it's not an endowment. Because the governance of it and the diplomatic work around it is done in secret and not in a transparent way. And I think we need to be very keen in this conversation around critical minerals and rare earths and what we mean about those.
Thank you. Madam over there, and then you, sir.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ambassador Carmen Schmidt, former South African ambassador and current chair of the projects and programs for the League of African Ambassadors. I just want to ask, I'm going to be as quick as possible, a couple of very important questions. So why do we need European democracy to define us? That's one question, because we are Africa and we Pan-Africanist, and that's where everything has gone wrong. And secondly, capital is coming to haunt us. that was mentioned. What about the sunset clause? Nobody speaks about it because that seems to be the problem in our critical minerals and everything. Then structural issues, we need to re-anchor that. But, and we spoke about economic trade and how we deal with the currency deficit, repatriation. But European countries have made a commitment to climate change, which they did not adhere to. So how much guarantee would we have on that issue? And then the AU 2063 agenda never translates locally. We talk about it in air. And we talk about ACFA in air. I was just at the National Entrepreneurship Strategy, where I met people that trade internationally across borders, but they don't know what the AU 2063 agenda is. So, I mean, really, how do we talk about a strategy in South Africa that we'd never allow our rest of South Africans to know? And then digital strategy, everybody talks about this digitalization, our curriculum stays the same. How do you expect things to change? Thank you.
Thank you. And then the final one in this round, it's just the gentleman there on the back.
Thank you. My slant will be different. I'll try and speak from the layman point of view.
Sorry, could I ask you just to introduce yourself?
I'm from Blue Downs. A lady phoned in here one day to Ashraf Garda and she said, we fought for freedom. And they gave us this democracy. Now people can come, they can get free medicine here. The clinics, Zimbabwe women, pregnant women come, get birth here because they want children to be young. And then at the end of the day, children come for school and so on. The point is, we get nothing. We fought against apartheid. And the democracy is only for those people that can do as they please. Because in prison, they get food and everything and so on and so on and so on. And my question is this at the end of the day is, can we say that the only people down there, do they still trust this democracy? That's number one. And then the AU, we toy with these foreign nationals. I'm not sure what the AU is doing because for me, the AU is comprised of a bunch of Asian dictators. They can do nothing. Because once they do what they're supposed to do and have true democracy, we won't have an influx of foreign nationals. They don't here because they love us. They're here because they want to make a living. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'll open for one more round before we close. I noticed some people, I'll open later. But I just thought like maybe for us to reflect. Let's just reflect a little bit on this and then I'll do another round. Maybe I'll just reflect briefly on one or 2 points and then we can go through that. I think Alia's question on diversification is an important one. Because of course, I think within the context of the speech is very much mentioned that we need new partners, new players, and who are these new partners or players? The interesting thing for me is that first is not a process that South Africa is doing alone. There is a global readjustment process on who do we engage with, who do we trade with, and how do we actually reconcile relationships that are often quite historically traumatic, problematic, with different layers of depth. I thought it was quite interesting in November last year with the EU-AU summit in Angola, because it was one of those first summits that it didn't feel entirely that when we're talking about Europe-Africa relations, we're talking necessarily about Europe in Africa. And I think that is often what we are talking about, right? We're talking about European investments, aid, engagements, border issues, migrations, a lot of things that are often very much framed within those terms. I think we are in a stage where we have a rupture not only of the global order or orders or whatever that means, but we have even within this kind of Western core, and I call it the core not because they are more important, but particularly because it has been the driver and the sustainer of many of those principal ideas, and many of us in the margins kind of fighting to include ideas of sovereignty, issues of human rights in the 70s, issues of self-determination. These are all global South issues that were not included without a fight, without an argument, without a debate. Because at the end of the day, we're all trying to think of what brings us closer to one another and what separates from one another. How much are we able to agree to disagree? Because we're not necessarily going to have this clear-cut ideas of that
not all of us need to look like Switzerland to be considered to be great. There's other paths, there's other ways in which that is to be done, and I think Karabo's paper very much looking to some of those different aspects. But also I think what it provides as an opportunity, there is also an intrinsic sense that we have a very difficult relationship with one of our largest trading partners, the United States, something that is notorious, that is well known, but at the same time, I don't think there is enough belief that China is entirely the alternative. Have we reached a cap of how much more can we do? The agreements right now, is that much more than we can do, and are we not going into similar risks that we had? For me, one of the most important geopolitical and geoeconomic events that occurred last year was the ASEAN Summit in Malaysia. The fact that you had that huge list of global leaders in there is primarily because we're starting to look now into our blind spots. We're trying to look into blind spots into other regions within the global south, whether it's Southeast Asia. We're looking into regions like Latin America that has these historical relations but very superficial types of engagements. But fundamentally, we're looking into Africa not just from a Pan-Africanist ideological position. That is an important driver. But for me, I think what it does is a very pragmatic understanding that if we're looking to different growth frontiers in the world, Latin America had its period, Southeast Asia had its period. It's pretty natural for us to think that Africa is the next frontier. And the fact that we already trade a lot with the continents, with a lot of the caveats, we were talking about this yesterday, Sanusha, but it's a fundamentally important market from an economic point of view, but it's a very important for South Africa in terms of a credibility and legitimacy supported to a lot of its positions. Whether it's through common African positions, whether it's through the role of the 3 African members of the UN Security Council. It doesn't always work. We are a very divided continent. But when it does work, it tends to be quite powerful. So let me stop here, just sort of choosing one, and maybe just give it to Sanusha and then Loazi, and then I'll do the opening. There is more names than what we're going to be able to accommodate, so we're going to have to either make the choice, the comments and reflections to be very brief, or that we're going to have to choose some out of those. Sorry.
So I think that the interesting thing about the speech is that he talks about increasing international partnerships. There's a whole section on industrial capacity, reviving the ferrochrome industry, the container port in Durban, which is now going to be managed by an international rails operator, which is quite fascinating because I don't know how Kasatu is going to react to that. But it comes back to Transnet. And more importantly, it is about this idea that we, in the global economic turbulence, we have competitive advantage. I'm paraphrasing. The challenge of that is that the speech projects self-sufficiency, but when you start to unpack it, you start to take it apart, it's not self-sufficient. So the perception, I mean, it's Kenneth Waltz's, your distribution of resources and your perception of capabilities. That's the realist, neo-realist debate. And that's what we're thinking about in this speech around that. So I don't know if there is an approach. And I think the problem is that, and with all due respect, sometimes shooting from the hip doesn't work anymore. And then where is this competitive advantage if we come back to Lucanio's point about critical minerals? Because we keep hearing that we need to take the minerals out of the ground, we need to value add them, and then voila, we'll have an electric battery or whatever. But the point is, what do you want to be in the value chain of critical minerals? And the critical minerals that were always that had that performance, like a F1 performance kind of thing, was gold, where you see where the price of gold is now. But you go to Botswana and you ask Botswana, how are you managing now with diamonds? Because, everybody said you are the success story of the diamond industry. De Beers is selling the company. You've got 2 competitors. You've got a Botswanan government competing to buy the De Beers stake, but you also got Angola that's competing to buy the De Beers stake. And that's an interesting SADC rivalry, right? But there's a third element here. Younger people are not worried about whether you're going to get a Hope diamond that's, 43 million rand. But we can buy artificial diamonds. Who's in that industry? And is that the reason why De Beers is moving out of it? So your scale of critical minerals is now around your electric technological space, and that is your cobalt and whatever. And that is why the DRC is interesting if we think of what was happening at the mining Indaba. But we also know that if you want to be competitive, you don't have to produce the electric vehicle. You produce the component parts to the electric vehicle. And I'm not hearing that in the specification of technical, of your technical framework of industrialization. So you take the chrome out, or you take the cobalt out. What are you doing with it? I mean, if you just think about why silver went the way it did in the last couple of days, the demand versus supply, China put out licenses. The rare earths, China controls 98% of that. We do have rare earths, but how are we going to compete with that? So this question about how we look at critical minerals in terms of the global headwinds or whatever is what makes us competitive. And it's something that Matthew Park said after the State of the Nation address yesterday. And Kusato has been making issuing these warning signs around protect the industries around manufacturing, because you've got to protect labor. Because you can't compete. I mean, think about the holistic BYD that comes into your car, the electric vehicle from China. It's outstripping competition in the market. How are you going to compete with that? Because you also got to think about where your wages and your inflation levels and your negotiations with your labor is going to be. So I don't know how that fits into the tripartite alliance. But at the same time, and of course you got 3% inflation. So you got the Reserve Bank that's going, keep it 3%. Don't eat, don't consume, just keep it 3%. So these are the structural questions. I think I'm very cynical of what does this mean in the context of not just South Africa, but Agenda 2063. And I'm not sure if, well, some of us will be around when Agenda 2063 matures. Some of us won't be around. So we won't see it. The people that will be around is the youth, and the question is, what are they going to see in Agenda 2063? So I think the challenge we have is to come back to the question about whether there's still trust in this government or in this democracy. I think there are a number of moving parts that is basically challenging that trust. And of course, in a local government election year, the IEC has the really bad and the really unenviable task of managing an election when you have stakeholders or you have disruptors to that election encouraging people to deregister. And when they start to deregister, you've got to ask yourself what kind of election results you're going to have. So you got 2 voters' rolls, and there was a report that none of the media picked up and said, hang on, something is happening in our local government election year where the IEC is saying, we're getting emails to deregister from the voters' roll. What's going to happen to the disruptive nature? And I'm not saying that it's what Mark Carney said of the rupture of the international system. It was rupturing for the longest time ever. It's just that suddenly somebody woke up and realized.
And they were from Canada. That was the why Mark Carney got so much traction in that end. It's a Western leader. So there are multiple aspects that we need to deal with, especially because the gentleman was talking about the AU, and since the AU is currently sitting, we might as well talk about it. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement is not just a trade agreement, but it's also a people's agreement. There's a protocol on people-to-people movement within the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which only 4 or 5 countries have ratified on the continent. Meaning that in order for us to fully realize the AFCTA as envisaged by its drafters, more African countries will have to ratify the people-to-people movement. But due to either the economics or social pressures at a domestic level and perceptions around immigration that exist both domestically within countries and also internationally, and the rise of right-wing politics and conservative understanding of people who are foreigners, we've seen lack of ratification of these important pieces which will allow greater border movement of African goods and people. So that's a very critical aspect about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement that we fail to address time and time again, because we have to deal with the issue of how do we manage those who are othered. The second aspect of it is that we have entered a year of the decade of reparations. Last year was the year of reparations for the AU. This is a decade of reparations. We have not sat down as the African continent and defined what we want in terms of these reparations. And how we define what we want could also lead on to aspects of how we deal with the critical minerals within the continent, how we deal with issues of industrialization and technologies within the African continent, and also how we now engage with European peers and the trumpeters too. So we have to be concerted in our efforts when we're dealing with these, because for far too long we'll have the year of APNC, we'll have a number of talks, a position paper will be released, and nothing happens. So it is also incumbent upon us to hold our governments accountable to what agreements or initiatives they take up, especially at a multilateral level. And my other point, my final point I wanted to raise, Sanusha, was you were talking about the value chains. Yeah. What is really interesting is that in the delegation that South Africa has sent to the African Union, it's mainly the banks that have gone. Yeah. So what does that mean? We perceived our potential economic growth and development, and along the lines of not industrialization, but rather the financialization of the markets. And therefore we should be very, very, very careful when we're dealing with multilateral forums that we need to be very conscious of what is happening in terms of what are we financializing our economy, or are we going for industrialization in order for us to create goods to benefit our people. That is it, because we can artificially inflate the GDP by financialization of our industries and moving the numbers around. But until the actual jobs on the ground and people are working and eating, we will not make any headway going forward.
Okay, so can you raise your hand, the ones that wanted to speak? Can I ask you to be very almost telegraphic so that we can get everyone and us? Online. Let me start over there, and then I will go here, here, here. I have 4.
Thank you. My name is Isi Konovska. I work for the European Union in Brussels. A very quick question. We have the BRICS, we have G20, we have multiple alliances and formations in our global world today. Where do you think South Africa sees itself, where it should see itself? We had the recent BRICS Plus naval exercise. At the same time, we had the presidency of G20 by South Africa, which was very successful. You referred to the AU summit, you referred to relationships with the EU. So just where do you see it? Because some of these parts of the world don't necessarily stand on the same fronts. Thank you.
A friend to all and an enemy to none.
And then I have Swinker.
Thank you. Dzvinka Kacher from the Ukrainian Association of South Africa. Mr. Supra mentioned the topic of reparation, and we also discussed it here. Do you think that there is that ambition for South Africa to look a little bit beyond, and also on the current Russian imperial war? There are over 200,000 of documented war crimes that Russia already committed. And there is an ICJ decision on Russia's violation of International Convention on racial discrimination at the occupied territories. Do you think South Africa would be prepared to work together with Ukraine on designing those principles that would work for everyone?
Just over here. So there. You're welcome to.
Hi, my name is Penny Mowood. I'm a small business owner in heritage and media. So my question is, does democracy still belong in South Africa? Because it seems like democracy tends to split people up, and that's not really how Africa works.
And then final one here.
Thank you, Gustavo. Mine is very brief. Just to add on what Honorable Supra said and what the gentleman also said here, which is something we raised in the G20 Social Summit, the critical minerals. We believe that every mineral is critical. Almost every mineral is critical. Gold, the group of platinum group of metals, the use for those, the value of gold. So would wish, I think what we should add to the President's SONA speech is that we want to add and we want to create our own list as South Africa and as Africa about which minerals are critical, so that as we have this debate, we are conscious of the fact that others would view critical minerals as this, but as Africans, this is what we see as critical. Thank you.
Okay, and then I put it very briefly, please. But your youth and your voice is important, so
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Balingobetse and I am a master's student in health systems. So basically my question is, as a Gen Z, I see the collapse of European informed democracy, and my question is, does South Africa trust us, the youth, enough for us to change what we think or what we have modeled democracy to be? Yeah, if that makes sense.
okay. So I'm going to close now the questions because we don't have a lot of time. What I'm going to do, there's a couple of comments that came online. I'm just going to mention them. Basically, what we're going to have to do is fundamentally to pick and choose certain aspects, because and hopefully that we can hang around here for a little bit more, but just for food for thought. There is some, there was a question here about whether the lack of very specific mention to specific issues, whether it's Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Palestine, and the US, what does it mean? What is the signal of that? Does South Africa actually have a foreign policy based on established national interests? And perhaps I'm adding that from my side. What are those? What is in the national framework of 2022? Let me stop here. I apologize to people online. I apologize to people in the room that I couldn't do. So what we're going to do is just a final round of final reflections. Let me start with Loazi, Sanusha, and I'll make some comments at the end. And we do need to be a little bit brief in our final comments.
I'll be really quick. I'm just quickly start off with the Ukraine question. South Africa has been actively working on the Ukraine peace process, especially the Save the Children initiative, and which South Africa has contributed towards children being returned back, but is part of the committee that is working on that. South Africa is part of the committee on the Ukraine peace process. Whether or not that has managed to gain any traction, I'm not quite sure. But what you could do is engage the colleagues at DIRCO and see if that will be an uptaken initiative. The second aspect is that for far too long, we've always said that democracy is un-African. And this narrative that democracy is un-African and whether we should move away from democracy because it doesn't belong to us. But if you look at historically, democracy is African. Sometimes how we chose our kings and queens was through democratic processes where a community would sit and they would elect their leadership. Consultations by traditional leaders would sit with councils and elders of the communities to deliberate on decisions made by those communities and kingdoms. So democracy in its essence is an African conceptualization. What is not African is neoliberal democracy that we have undertaken. So whether or not how we conceptualize and structure our democracy is totally up to us, but those are conversations that needs to happen amongst ourselves. But democracy as practice is intrinsically African, and we should not divorce ourselves from a conceptualization of our own, right? And then when we talk about the issue around beneficiation and critical minerals, Sanusha raised a very important point, right? It would be a futile exercise if we take the raw ore out of our land, then we create these rolls of steel or platinum and then ship them off again. What are we actually making with these so-called critical minerals? What are the components and parts and where are we adding to the value chains that will actually fundamentally create more and more jobs within the country? And that is a very important point, especially when we're dealing with issue around value addition. What is the type of value addition that we're doing? Is it superficial value addition? We just put the raw minerals into a furnace and then take out the next product and then ship them off again, because we will not be creating the sufficient jobs that we want for our economy if we're going to do it like that. So we need a more robust and more comprehensive approach. And the issue around the lack of mentioning of specific issue subjects, State of the Nation's address historically have not mentioned specific issue addresses. It's only in the debates following the President's address that the Minister of International Relations or their deputy will go in further details concerning issue-specific issues. So for the audience online, do not fear. Some of the issues that you want to be raised might be raised, but the State of the Nation address is a policy speech, and therefore the day-to-day issues that might come up. So, for example, the President, I highly doubt the President will mention Donald Trump by name in any of the State of the Nation addresses, especially relating to foreign policy, but the positionality of South Africa in relation to the rest of the world will be deliberated on.
I think the other thing we need to understand about the State of the Nation, it's not a blueprint. It is a roadmap. And the onus of now getting this roadmap to where it needs to be in the year to 2027 is that you got to get your interministerial processes up and running. And there's a question about the national interest. And for years, I think Palani and all colleagues have been arguing, we've been arguing that the white paper on Ubuntu is not a national strategy document. You've got to start thinking about the world in what the President has identified as global headwinds in the global economy, the turbulence, the volatility. The document that was produced in 2011, 2012 is a fundamentally different world than what we have today. And that goes for a lot of our foreign policy on the national interest. Because I think it's a very good question that was raised by Dr. Pue online around what is the national interest? It's not about the documents, not about the words. What is the national interest? What is your national interest strategy? Because if you don't have that, it doesn't give you a sense of where your foreign policy is. But I think the onus of this is now whether or not DIRCO starts to think about the operationalization of what you need to do from the speech. And this raises another fundamental question for me is who is making foreign policy? Where are the decisions being made in foreign policy? One of the things I find very interesting about the President's speech, and then of course, the State of the Nation, and you look at the year in review after the State of the Nation has been announced, made, is that you get a sense that there's a set of processes happening in the presidency, and that cabinet is just the kind of bystander that looks in. And we know this, Palani, from our work with oversight in Parliament, is that they want to create rules that now create oversight for the presidency. We know that because the executive is cabinet, but the decision-making seems to happen outside in the parallels of union building as the real center of decision-making. So I think we need that understanding of what is the role of DIRCO, what is the role in terms of operationalizing foreign policy. Final 2 points I think we need to be very clear about in terms of what South Africa is going to look like in the next 2 years will depend on what happens in local government elections. Those municipalities that sit on the border, I don't know if there was any mention of the Border Management Agency, but there was border management issues that was raised in that. It's not about whether or not you are controlling the immigration migration issue. There was something that the Honorable Chair said, which was we are withdrawing from the DRC UNESCO because we want to go to more deeper dialogue and put resources in there. How many of us remember that this was the actual mandate of South Africa post-1994 based on the issues of peace, stability, and development for Africa? We did a survey, and I'll end on this. We did a survey when we were at the Open Society Foundation, which we looked at, and we asked the question, what is most fundamental to South African foreign policy? Is it, as people are claiming, the human rights question? Whether we'll go and further the kind of normative value process. And we wanted to test the hypothesis about where this was coming from. Surprisingly, South African citizens are much more sophisticated than we give them credit. They actually said, we need to do more trade in Africa, because if you do more trade in Africa, you create the conditions in African states to stabilize those economies so people can have jobs in those economies. But we're not discarding human rights. So the point about where our foreign policy should be lying, I think, is that there's a mandate that we can go back and look at. The problem is South African capital moved into Africa, they became they became dominant, then they moved out, then they started to deal with competition from China, India, and other actors, and now it's the Gulf states, and now they're busy struggling in this environment. So I think the idea of peace, security, and development, peace, stability, and development was key, and we did this in the post-apartheid corporate expansion debates.
Yeah. So I want to try to be as brief. I had to really select some, so maybe after we can discuss it. And I wanted to talk to you about the reparations issues, because I think it's an interesting question. But I wanted to start with the question from the colleague from the European Union, and I think it is an important one. Because I think when we're looking to South Africa, there is always a clear sense of a country of multiple identities. It is a Southern African country, is an African country, is part of the non-aligned movement, is from the Global South, is a BRICS member, is a member of the UN. It has all of those multiple aspects, and fundamentally none of them seems to be seen within its core as mutually exclusive. BRICS is a very important platform for South Africa, but South Africa is also very clear there is simply certain topics that BRICS is not the right forum for. The whole issue that you and I, Senator, have been saying for years of BRICS operates through a process of agreeing to disagree, because consensus is seen both as a mechanism but also as a value, which forces members always to say, like, we're simply not going to find agreements within this particular topic, so we might as well talk about democracy or human rights in different forums. Let's focus our energy within this group, not really an alliance, because it doesn't operate strategically enough to fundamentally change and shift a lot of the core of the directions that the country is taking. It impacts how the country reacts and the calculations that it makes, and I think particularly when we're thinking around the reluctance of engaging with certain topics, particularly when it relates to some of the concerns that it has. But fundamentally for South Africa, being a member of BRICS is not one that South Africa sees itself as being part of an anti-Western bloc. It's much more about a self-perception of we are non-Western, and this group provides us a voice in certain forums that we simply wouldn't have otherwise, not because we love all of them equally and not because they are really at the core. If that was the case, South Africa would vote very differently as a whole, not within the specifics, within the United Nations, within other groups. South Africa still votes much closer with European countries in the UN than what it does with Russia and China. In general, there is specific issues where, of course, there are deviations. So in that sense, what it seems to me, it's pressuring and forcing South Africa to choose. You're either with this group or that, often has the opposite reaction, because that gives the choice for South Africa in itself. Because if we look at that within the context of major global powers, the US is very powerful, China is very powerful, Europe is quite powerful too, but none of them are perceived to be powerful enough that they justify an exclusive choice. And that, I think, for me, is fundamental to understand why some of these decisions become inconsistent, why some of these decisions become difficult. Becomes a process of what our interests are, what our priorities are in a particular moment, what do we have to gain and lose, and what are the different avenues and strategies that we are aiming to pursue, not just in terms of non-alignment, because non-alignment is not neutrality. It's an autonomy-seeking pathway. That's, for me, is the fundamental aspect when we're thinking about those groupings, those engagements. And I think this is the ability of agreeing to disagree not only within the context of BRICS, because it's a very specific situation in very dissimilar countries that don't trade a lot with one another and have a broad but narrow agenda at the same time. That ability that we have to agree to disagree, that we can have partners in other parts of the world, that we have deep disagreements around the South African reaction towards the war in Ukraine or towards the naval exercise that occurred a couple of weeks ago, that has a big domestic aspect, but also a bigger aspect around how do we engage with those. I think that for me is key, that we find some of those common grounds and we are able to then find the different advantages, the same way European countries find different ways that sometimes is OECD, sometimes is the European Union, sometimes is the Security Council. Even with the US kind of changing direction, there's certain issues that Europe and the US will continue having a lot of similarity, even if there is a decoupling. But other issues, there is increasing and more differences. And I think that is in itself an opportunity. That is in itself an opportunity for different parts of the world that may have a lot of differences, but fundamentally see certain things in similar ways. African countries find multilateralism useful because we're very weak. We know we're very weak on our own. The numbers is important and the collective action is important when it's possible. Very similar view than what we see in Europe, for instance. And in that sense, we start seeing those two continents often really being the champions of multilateralism, because we've learned over the years that without it, we're actually simply irrelevant. Anyway, I'm going to stop with the comments now, and I wanted to really thank all of you here in the room in Cape Town for those conversations. We still have food around. For those of you that haven't eaten yet, feel free to hang around and continue those conversations. For those of you that have joined us online, thank you very much. Thank you for all of the comments that you've made. I'm sorry I was not able to get everyone in the room and online that had made comments and questions to giving you the floor. But it does show to me how important those conversations are. And for me, what it was a conversation. It was perspectives, reflections, which goes back to the issue of democracy. For me, it does matter because this is why we're having conversations in spaces like this. It's not all what democracy is, but these very loud aspects of the South African democracy, for me, is an advantage. It makes it difficult for us because we have to filter the noise, but that fundamentally, living in a society where having those debates, criticizing, supporting, agreeing and disagreeing, for me, I think it is what makes SONA an important signal, but for me, it's always more interesting what happens after SONA, because now it's when we start deconstructing many of those thoughts. So thank you very much for all of you once again.
I want to say thank you from IGD side and SALO side for all the heavy lifting you did to put this event together. I mean, we couldn't be more appreciative for everything. And 1 week in the year, every year in February, Cape Townians get traumatized by SONA and the mining because it takes away their cities. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much,
everyone.
Gustavo.